I want to tell you about the night my own son looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into his dining room by mistake. Not a raised voice, no slammed door, just a slow, cold correction in front of 14 people, the kind that tells you exactly where you rank in a family you built with your own 2 hands. I did not cry that night. I smiled, I finished my coffee, and I went home and called my lawyer the next morning. That is where this story really starts, but let me back up first because you need to understand what came before that dinner to understand why I did what I did after it. Hi, I'm Dorothy. I'm 71 years old and I live alone in a little brick house on Larkspur Lane in Greenville, South Carolina. The same house I raised my son David in, the same house I paid off myself over 30 years standing behind a bakery counter. 6 weeks ago, at my own granddaughter's birthday dinner, my son and his wife, Melissa, stood up in front of the whole family and announced, calm as anything, that it was time somebody else started making my decisions for me. I have buried a husband, I have raised a child alone for years at a time, and nothing prepared me for hearing my own name discussed like I was a piece of furniture somebody wanted to move to a smaller room. Have you ever had the people you gave your whole life to talk about you, like you were already gone, right in front of you, like you could not hear a word of it? If you have, I think you will understand everything I'm about to tell you. Before I go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps this channel keep going so I can keep telling stories like mine. And while you are at it, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight because in a minute I am going to tell you exactly what was said at that table, and I have a feeling some of you have heard words just like it. I opened Whitfield's Bakery on Main Street when David was 4 years old, 2 years after my husband Frank passed from a heart attack that came out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning. I ran that shop for 28 years, kneading dough before sunrise, doing the books at night at my kitchen table after David went to sleep. I sold it when my knees finally gave out, and between the sale, my savings, and Frank's small pension, I have enough to live comfortably and enough left over, God willing, to leave something behind for the people I love. That house on Larkspur Lane and those savings are not just numbers to me. They are 30 years of my life turned into something solid. I can still smell that bakery if I close my eyes. The yeast and the burnt sugar smell that got into my hair and my sweaters no matter how many times I washed them. I would wake up at 4 in the morning, every single morning for 28 years, dress in the dark so I would not wake David, and drive to Main Street while the whole town was still asleep. There is a particular kind of tired that comes from that kind of life. Bone deep, the kind that settles into your knees and your lower back and never really leaves. But there is also a particular kind of pride that comes with it, the pride of watching a business you built with flour and sugar and stubbornness put a roof over your child's head. Frank and I married young, 20 and 22, in a little Baptist church 2 towns over from Greenville, and we did not have much of anything for the first 10 years except each other and a mortgage we were both terrified of. He worked at the textile mill until it closed, then he drove a delivery truck, and every single dollar either of us made went straight back into this house and into David. When Frank died, I remember standing in the kitchen afterward, looking at his coffee cup still sitting in the drying rack, and thinking quite clearly that I had 2 choices, fall apart or keep the lights on. I chose to keep the lights on, and I have been choosing that one way or another every single day since. For as long as anybody in my family can remember, I have been the one who shows up. I was the one who drove 3 hours in an ice storm when my sister broke her hip. I was the one who kept David's kids, my grandchildren, every single summer so David and Melissa could take their vacations. I was the one who wired money quietly when David's landscaping business nearly folded 4 years ago. No questions asked, no interest charged. I never once thought of myself as someone who needed taking care of. I thought of myself as the one who did the taking care of, and I was proud of that. Maybe that pride is exactly what made what happened next so hard to see coming. I raised David mostly alone in the years after Frank died, working days at the bakery and coming home most nights just in time to help with homework and get him fed and bathed and into bed. I remember one particular winter when he had pneumonia, sitting up with him 3 nights straight, dozing in the rocking chair with my hand on his little chest, just to feel it rise and fall, terrified in a way I do not think he has ever known a mother can be terrified. I do not say this to make myself sound like a martyr. I say it because I think it matters when you are trying to understand how it feels to be talked about like a burden by the very person you once stayed awake 3 nights running just to keep alive. These days my hands ache in the mornings before they loosen up, my knees complain on the stairs, and I need reading glasses to see a menu in dim light. I am not going to sit here and tell you that 71 feels the same as 51, because it does not. But feeling older in your body is a different thing entirely from being unfit to run your own life. And somewhere along the way, my son and his wife stopped being able to tell the difference between the two, or perhaps they simply found it convenient to pretend they could not. It did not start with anyone attacking me outright. It started small, the way these things always do. It started about a year ago with little comments, little corrections, little moments where I would say something and Melissa would glance at David like they were sharing a private joke about me. At the time, I told myself I was being sensitive, that families are complicated, that everybody's grown children think they know better eventually. I did not realize I was watching the opening moves of something much bigger, something that had been planned out far more carefully than I wanted to admit. One of the moments that should have warned me came at a routine appointment with my own doctor back in the spring. David had insisted on driving me, which I appreciated at the time. But when Dr. Alvarez asked me a simple question about my blood pressure medication, David answered before I could open my mouth, and then continued answering 3 more questions meant for me about my sleep, about my appetite, about whether I had been feeling confused lately. Dr. Alvarez, to her credit, kept redirecting the questions back to me, but I remember sitting on that exam table in a paper gown, my own son answering for me like I was a child who had wandered into the wrong room, and feeling something curdle quietly in my stomach. The third-person talk started around Easter. I would be sitting right there at Melissa's table, close enough to touch, and I would hear her say to David, right over my head, "Does she seem more forgetful to you lately? Do you think we should say something?" Not to me, about me, while I sat 2 feet away holding a cup of coffee that suddenly tasted like nothing. I would ask a simple question. "Where did you get this casserole dish?" And Melissa would answer David instead of me, like I needed a translator for my own family. By early summer, the comments turned into suggestions, and the suggestions had a shape to them that I recognized even though nobody said it outright. David started asking, gently at first, if I had ever thought about setting up a power of attorney, just in case, just to make things easier down the road. He said it the way you would suggest an umbrella before rain, reasonable, caring, impossible to argue with without sounding paranoid. I told him I already had a will and a trusted attorney, and that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. "Thank you very much." He smiled and dropped it that time. Melissa started calling me 2, sometimes 3 times a week that summer, always in the same bright, careful voice, just checking in, "Dorothy, just making sure you're doing all right over there." At first I was touched. Then I noticed the questions always circled back to the same handful of topics. Had I paid my bills on time? Did I remember to lock up at night? Was I still comfortable driving myself places? Was I sure I did not want someone to come stay with me for a while? It took me embarrassingly long to realize those were not check-in calls. They were audits, dressed up in a daughter-in-law's sweet voice. Around the same time, David traded in his old pickup for a brand new one, black, gleaming payments that I happened to overhear him complaining about to his brother-in-law at a cookout. It struck me quietly that my own car, a 9-year-old Buick I bought used and paid off in full, was worth less than the monthly payment on his new truck. I am not a woman who cares much about things like that, but I noticed it, the way you notice a crack in a wall you walk past every day. Something in their life had gotten more expensive, and I could not help wondering where they thought the extra cushion was going to come from. Melissa started wearing a new watch that fall, gold, the kind you do not buy on a landscaping business budget, and new earrings that caught the light every time she leaned in to whisper something to David at dinner. I never said a word about it. It was not my business what she wore, but I am a woman who spent 30 years watching numbers not add up in a bakery ledger, and something about the timing of it all sat uneasy in the back of my mind, the same way a burnt smell sits in a kitchen long after you find the pan. The first time it really stung was at a 4th of July barbecue at David and Melissa's house. I forgot the name of Melissa's cousin's new baby, a small thing, the kind of thing anybody forgets in a yard full of 40 people and 3 different conversations happening at once. Melissa laughed, not unkindly on the surface, and said, "Oh, Dorothy, we really do need to start writing things down for you, don't we?" A few people chuckled. I laughed along too, because what else do you do? But I felt my face go hot, and I felt something inside me quietly close a door it had never closed before. After that barbecue, I started dreading family gatherings in a way I never had before in my whole life. I used to look forward to those Sunday dinners and holiday parties more than almost anything. Now I found myself rehearsing what I would say beforehand, double-checking names in my head before I walked in the door, like I was preparing for a test I had not studied for. I hated that feeling. I hated that in my own family, among people who shared my blood, I had started performing competence instead of simply living my life. That same summer, my friend Helen's neighbor, a woman named Ruth I had known casually for years, was moved into a memory care facility by her own daughter, over what Ruth herself later told Helen was one bad week of forgetting where she put her car keys. Ruth had owned her home outright, same as me. Within 8 months of moving into that facility, her daughter had sold the house, and the money had, in Ruth's words, mostly disappeared into fees and expenses nobody had fully explained to her. I remember hearing that story and feeling a cold finger run down my spine, though at the time I told myself my own family would never do something like that to me. In August, I found out through my granddaughter, not through David, that the family had already decided where Thanksgiving would be held that year, at David and Melissa's house, with a guest list that had apparently been discussed and finalized without one single phone call to me. I have hosted Thanksgiving in my home for 32 years straight. When I asked David about it, gently, not looking to start a fight, he said, "Oh, Mom, we just figured it would be easier on you this year. You have been seeming tired." I had not told anyone I was tired. I had not been tired. I had been quietly erased from a decision about my own family and dressed up as a kindness. There was a Tuesday night card game, the kind our family had done for years, canasta around my own dining table, that Melissa quietly moved to her house that autumn without asking me, explaining afterward that it was simply easier since she had more parking. I sat at my own empty dining table that following Tuesday, cards still in the drawer, and understood that even the small rituals of my life were being relocated around me, one at a time, like furniture being rearranged in a house I no longer got a vote in. Around October, without fully deciding to, I started keeping a small spiral notebook in my kitchen drawer, jotting down dates and quotes whenever something happened that troubled me. The canasta game moved without asking. The comment about writing things down, the Thanksgiving decision made behind my back. I told myself at the time it was simply to keep my own thoughts straight, that writing things down helped an old woman like me remember what was real. Looking back, I think some quieter, more clear-eyed part of me already understood I might need a record one day, long before I understood exactly why. In September, I tried once, quietly, just the two of us, to talk to David about how some of these things had been making me feel. We sat on my back porch with sweet tea, and I told him, as gently as I knew how, that the comments about my memory, the questions about whether I could still handle my own bills, were starting to wear on me. He patted my hand and told me I was imagining problems that were not there, that nobody thought less of me, that I was just noticing things because I was, in his words, more sensitive than I used to be. I remember driving away from that conversation feeling worse than before I had it. Because now, on top of everything else, I had been told that my own perception of my own life could not be trusted. I did not say anything else about it. That is the part I want you to understand, because I think a lot of women my age will recognize this in themselves. I did not want to be the difficult mother-in-law, the paranoid old woman who reads conspiracies into every kind gesture. So I swallowed it the way I had swallowed so many things over the years, and I told myself I was choosing peace. I told myself that keeping the family together was worth a little pride. I did not yet understand that peace bought with silence has a way of costing you more than you agreed to pay. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it makes this harder and more true than a simple story of villains and victims. I did not stop loving David during any of this. I loved him the whole time fiercely, the way you love a child you nursed through pneumonia and taught to ride a bicycle and cried over at his wedding. That love did not protect me from what was happening. If anything, it made it harder to see clearly because I kept looking for the boy I raised inside the man who was slowly trying to take my life out of my own hands. And some nights I still catch myself looking for him. Looking back now, I can see exactly how deliberate it all was. One small step after another, each one designed to be too small to fight over on its own. But at the time, all I knew was that something in my own home, in my own family, had shifted under my feet, and I could not get solid ground back no matter how I tried. I had no idea that the real test, the one that would break everything open, was still 6 weeks away, waiting for me at my granddaughter's birthday dinner. The dinner that changed everything was for my granddaughter Emma's 16th birthday, held at a private room in a steakhouse just outside town. The kind of place with white tablecloths and a private dining room David had rented for the occasion. 14 of us were there, my sister, cousins, old family friends, David's in-laws, and me sitting near the head of the table where I always sat, next to Emma, who I have loved fiercely since the day she was born. I remember thinking, walking in, that it felt like any other family dinner. I had no idea I was walking into the moment that would end up changing the whole shape of my life. The room itself was lovely, the kind of place David and Melissa liked to be seen in, dark wood paneling, low gold lighting, a private server just for our table. I noticed sitting down that Melissa was wearing that same gold watch again, along with a new bracelet I had not seen before, and that David had parked that gleaming black truck of his right at the valet stand out front where everyone walking in would see it. I'm not a woman who begrudges anybody nice things they can afford. I only mention it because looking back, I think about how much all of that costs, and I think about the folder that would end up on a coffee table 3 weeks later, and I wonder how much of what happened that night had already been decided by numbers on a page long before anyone said a word out loud. Before dinner even started, I went to the ladies' room, and on my way back, I passed close enough to David and Melissa, tucked into a corner by the coat check, to hear fragments of what they were saying. I heard the word arrangement, I heard the word timing. I heard Melissa say, "We just need to bring it up while everyone's here, so she can't make a scene about it later." I did not understand yet what they meant. I told myself it was about seating or cake or some detail of Emma's party. I went back to my seat and smiled and asked Emma about her softball season, and I tried very hard to believe what I had just heard was nothing. I sat back down at that table and tried, very hard, to talk myself out of what I had just heard. I told myself I was 71 years old, not senile, but perhaps overly sensitive after a hard year. Perhaps hearing conspiracy in ordinary conversation the way tired, anxious people sometimes do. I have thought about that moment many times since, the way I policed my own instincts, softened my own alarm bells, gave the benefit of the doubt to 2 people who, it turned out, had already decided the benefit was not going to run in my direction. I think many women my age do exactly what I did in that moment. We have spent so long being called dramatic or difficult that we learn to doubt ourselves before we ever get the chance to doubt anyone else. Dinner went along pleasantly enough for the first hour. We toasted Emma. My sister told an old story about David falling into a lake as a boy that made the whole table laugh, me loudest of all. I remember thinking in that hour that maybe I had imagined the whole thing by the coat check, that maybe I was the paranoid old woman I had spent all year trying not to become. I want you to sit with that feeling for a second, because I think it is the cruelest part of this kind of situation, the way it makes you doubt your own 2 good ears even when they have told you the truth. Then, right as the waiter cleared the entrees and before the cake came out, David tapped his glass with a fork, the way you do for a toast, and the whole table went quiet and turned toward him, expecting some sweet speech about his daughter turning 16. Instead, he looked at me, not at Emma, at me, and something in his face, some rehearsed calm, told me in that instant that whatever was coming had nothing to do with my granddaughter's birthday at all. He started gently enough, saying how much the family loved me, how hard I had worked my whole life, how nobody appreciated a mother more than he did. I remember relaxing half an inch, thinking, all right, this is a nice moment, maybe I misheard everything earlier. Then he said that the family, and he used that word, the family, had been talking, and that everyone agreed it might be time to look into some options for me, somewhere with more support, more people around, less for me to worry about on my own. He said the word community. He did not say the word facility, but everyone at that table understood exactly what he meant. As David kept talking, laying out his little speech about community and options and support, I found myself absurdly thinking about the day I taught him to ride a bicycle in the parking lot behind the bakery, running alongside him with one hand hovering near the seat, promising him I would not let go even when I already had. I do not know why that memory chose that exact moment to surface, except perhaps because some part of me was searching, uselessly, for proof that the boy who trusted me to catch him was still somewhere inside the man, now telling a table full of relatives that I could no longer be trusted to run my own life. I remember very specific, useless details from that exact moment, the way your mind does when something enormous is happening. I remember the candle on the table had burned down to a small pool of wax shaped like a comma. I remember the busboy hovering awkwardly by the kitchen door, unsure whether to come clear the plates. I remember that Emma's fork was halfway to her mouth, frozen there, a bite of cake she never finished. And I remember thinking with a strange detached clarity, so this is what it feels like. Being voted off your own life by the people who are supposed to love you most over dessert in front of witnesses who ordered the same steak I did. I sat there in that private dining room with 14 faces turned toward me, my fork still in my hand, and I felt the floor tilt underneath my chair. Melissa jumped in right behind him, her voice sweet as syrup, saying that of course nobody wanted to take anything away from me. They just worried about me being alone in that big house, and honestly at my age, forgetting names and dates the way I had been, it might be safer for everyone. She said at my age like it was a diagnosis. She said forgetting names and dates like I had a chart of symptoms instead of one missed name at the barbecue 8 weeks earlier. Nobody at that table said a word in my defense. Not my sister, who looked down at her napkin. Not David's in-laws, who suddenly found their water glasses fascinating. Even Emma, 16 years old and clearly uncomfortable, just looked back and forth between her parents and me with an expression I will never forget, somewhere between confusion and second-hand shame. I understood in that silence exactly how alone I was in that room full of people who supposedly loved me. Later, much later, Emma would tell me that she wanted to say something that night, that she had opened her mouth twice and closed it again because she did not know what a 16-year-old was supposed to say when her parents ambushed her grandmother at her own birthday dinner. I told her, when she finally said this to me, that I never once blamed her for staying quiet, that grown adults at that table with 40 and 50 years of life behind them had said nothing either, and that I would never expect a child to carry a weight her own parents and aunts and uncles could not lift. But I remember, in the moment itself, feeling a flash of something like grief watching her small, frozen face because I understood that this ugliness was now something she would remember about her own birthday for the rest of her life. I did not raise my voice, I did not throw my napkin down or storm out the way I imagined some women would have, and honestly, some part of me still wishes I had. Instead, I said very quietly that I appreciated everyone's concern, that I was not ready to discuss my living arrangements over birthday cake, and that I would like to change the subject so Emma could enjoy the rest of her party. David looked almost disappointed that I had not given him more to work with. Melissa gave me a small, tight smile, the kind that says we will circle back to this later. And we finished that dinner like nothing had happened, while inside me something had already started to change shape. The drive home from that steakhouse was one of the quietest 20 minutes of my life. I did not cry, I did not talk. I just drove, both hands on the wheel, watching the streetlights slide across my windshield, replaying David's voice saying the word community over and over in my head. When I got home, I sat in my driveway for a long moment before I even went inside, looking at that little brick house, the one I had scrubbed and painted and paid for with 30 years of flour under my fingernails, and I thought, they want to take this from me and call it love. I did not sleep much that night. I sat up in my kitchen, the same kitchen table where I had done the bakery books for decades, and I let myself feel every bit of what had happened, the humiliation, the fear underneath it, the particular grief of realizing that the people who should protect you most are sometimes the ones planning around you instead of with you. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, sitting there in the dark with a cup of chamomile tea gone cold in front of me, I made a decision. I was not going to fight them across a dinner table. I was going to protect myself the quiet way, the way I have always handled everything that mattered, carefully and on paper. I thought, sitting there in the dark, about all the years I had spent making sure everyone else in my family was taken care of first, my portion of dinner always a little smaller, my own doctor's appointments always rescheduled around everybody else's school plays and soccer games, my own wants tucked away in some drawer I rarely opened. I thought about how easily David and Melissa had assumed I would keep doing that, keep shrinking, keep making room, right up until there was no room left for me at all. Something in me, sitting at that table at 2 in the morning, simply refused to shrink any further. I did not decide to fight anybody. I decided quietly to stop disappearing. First thing the next morning, I called Patricia Coleman, the elder law attorney who had handled my affairs since Frank passed away 22 years ago. Patricia is sharp as a tack, close to my own age, and she has never once in 2 decades made me feel like a burden for asking a legal question. When I told her what had happened at that dinner, there was a pause on the line, and then she said quietly, "Dorothy, I think it's time we sat down and looked at everything, your will, your accounts, all of it." I told her I agreed, and we set an appointment for that same week. I have trusted Patricia Coleman for over 2 decades, ever since she helped me sort out Frank's modest life insurance policy and the deed to this house after he passed. She is not a flashy woman, no big downtown office, just a small practice above a hardware store on Elm Street. But she has never once been wrong about the law, and she has never once made me feel foolish for asking a question twice. When she told me, sitting across her scarred wooden desk, that what David and Melissa had been doing had a name, a pattern elder law attorneys see often enough to recognize instantly, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Relief, mostly, at simply being believed. I told Helen a little of what was happening, not everything, not yet, but enough. We were sitting on her porch one evening in early September, and she listened without interrupting, the way good friends do. And when I finished, she said, "Dorothy, you raised that boy on your own with nothing. You built a business with your bare hands, and now somebody wants you to believe you cannot manage a checkbook." She did not tell me what to do. She simply reminded me in a handful of sentences of exactly who I already was, which turned out to be exactly what I needed to hear before I ever picked up the phone to call Patricia. In the 3 days before my appointment with Patricia, I did something I'm not particularly proud of, though I do not regret it either. I went back through a year of text messages from Melissa and took screenshots of the ones that troubled me most, the ones checking whether I had paid bills on time, the one asking if I was sure I should still be driving at night, the one from just after the 4th of July barbecue that read, "Love you, Dorothy. We just want to make sure you're safe," with a photo attached of me looking tired and a little lost in someone's backyard, a photo I do not remember anyone taking. I printed them all out and put them in a folder of my own, because I have learned in 71 years that memory fades but paper does not. Sitting in Patricia's office 3 days later, I laid it all out for her. The small comments over the past year, the power of attorney suggestion, the Thanksgiving decision made behind my back, and finally, the dinner itself. David's speech, Melissa's syrupy concern, the silence of everyone at that table. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes the whole time, and when I finished, she looked at me and asked one simple question. "Dorothy, who in your life has actually earned your trust?" I did not even have to think about my answer. Before I tell you what I decided, if you have ever had to make a hard, quiet decision like this one to protect yourself even from your own family, I would be grateful if you subscribed. It is free, and it helps keep this channel telling stories that matter to people like us. All right, let me tell you what Patricia and I decided that afternoon. The answer was easy once I let myself say it out loud. My grandson Ryan, Emma's older brother, 23 years old, had spent every summer of his college years helping me with yard work and grocery runs, not because anyone made him, but because he wanted to. My oldest friend Helen, who has lived 3 doors down for 20 years and drove me to every single one of my doctor's appointments after my hip surgery, never once complaining, never once asking for anything back. And the Greenville Animal Rescue, where I have volunteered on Saturday mornings for 12 years, feeding dogs nobody else wanted. Those were the people and the place that had actually shown up for me, not David. Not Melissa. Patricia explained the mechanics to me carefully, the difference between simply changing the beneficiaries in my will versus moving the house itself into a revocable living trust, which would make it much harder for anyone to challenge or interfere with after I was gone, and much harder for anyone to pressure me about while I was still living. We decided on both, a new will and a trust holding the house, with Ryan as successor trustee, meaning that if I ever truly became unable to manage my own affairs, it would be my grandson making decisions on my behalf according to instructions I wrote myself while I was of completely sound mind. Not David, and certainly not Melissa. Patricia and I spent that whole afternoon drafting a new will, one that removed David and Melissa entirely as beneficiaries, and restructured everything. The house, my savings, even a small trust for Emma and Ryan's education, so that it went to the people who had earned it through actual care rather than mere blood. Patricia also suggested we put language in place making it very clear the decision had been made with full mental competency, with a signed evaluation from my own doctor, specifically to head off exactly the kind of challenge David might try to bring later. I remember Patricia looking at me over her glasses and saying, "Dorothy, they are going to say you were not thinking clearly. We're going to make absolutely sure the paperwork says otherwise." Keeping that secret those first few days was harder than I expected. David called on Thursday to ask about Sunday dinner plans, as ordinary as anything, and I found myself talking to him about pot roast and green beans while a new, notarized will with his name removed from it sat in a folder on my kitchen counter, not 4 feet away. I did not feel guilty exactly. I felt something closer to grief, the strange grief of loving someone in the present tense, while quietly grieving the version of him you thought you knew. 2 days after that meeting, something happened that I still consider a strange kind of grace. I was cleaning out my purse and found my old digital voice recorder, the little one I used to record Emma's piano recitals and Ryan's silly stories, because my hearing is not what it used to be and I like to listen back later at home. I remembered, suddenly, that I had turned it on before Emma's birthday dinner to catch her blowing out the candles, and in the chaos of everything that happened, I had never actually turned it off. I sat down at my kitchen table, and I listened to the whole thing, start to finish, my hand shaking a little around my cup of coffee. There was Emma's sweet, off-key happy birthday. And then, 20 minutes later, there was every single word David and Melissa said about putting me in a facility. Every word about it being time for someone else to make my decisions. Every uncomfortable silence from the rest of the table. I had not gone looking for that recording. It had simply been sitting there, waiting, the whole ugly conversation preserved in my grandson's own birthday memory. I sat with that recording for a long time after it finished. My coffee gone cold, the kitchen clock ticking louder than I remembered it ever ticking before. Part of me wanted to march straight to David's house that same afternoon and play it for him, watch his face when he realized what he had said, and where. But I had spent enough years in that bakery, watching numbers, watching patterns, to know that the angriest move is rarely the smartest one. I made a copy of that file that same night, one for Patricia, one saved in 3 different places of my own, and then I did something that surprised even me. I put it away calmly like a woman putting a good knife back in its drawer, and I waited. For the next 3 weeks, I did not say a single word to David or Melissa about the will or the attorney or the recording sitting safely backed up on Patricia's office computer and my own laptop. I went about my life quietly, tending my garden, going to my Saturday mornings at the animal rescue, having Sunday coffee with Helen. If you had watched me from the outside, you would have thought absolutely nothing had changed. Inside, though, I had never felt steadier in my life. I was no longer waiting to be told what my life was going to look like. I already knew, and that knowledge sat in me like a keel underneath a boat, quiet, invisible, and exactly what kept me upright. During those quiet weeks of waiting, Emma called me twice just to talk about ordinary things, a boy she liked, a test she was nervous about, and both times I found myself listening to her voice and thinking, this is exactly why I am doing what I am doing, not out of spite toward her parents, but so that what I have spent a lifetime building still means something for the people in this family who show up simply because they love me, not because they are calculating what might come to them later. Then, on a Tuesday evening, David called and asked if I would come to a family meeting at his house that Sunday. Just to talk things through as a family. Nothing to worry about, he said. Just so everyone's on the same page. I agreed, calmly, and asked no questions, though I noticed he mentioned that his in-laws and my sister would also be there. A family meeting that included his in-laws and excluded notably Patricia or anyone actually qualified to discuss my legal affairs. I understood immediately that whatever was coming had been planned the same way that birthday dinner had been planned, with an audience assembled in advance. I arrived Sunday afternoon to find 8 people already seated in David and Melissa's living room, including, to my genuine surprise, a notary public David had apparently hired for the occasion, sitting stiffly in a folding chair near the window with a leather folder on her lap. Melissa greeted me with a hug a little too tight and a smile a little too bright, and David patted the couch cushion next to him like he was inviting a child to sit down for a talk. On the coffee table in front of us sat a manila folder, thick, official-looking, with my name typed neatly on the tab. I sat down slowly, aware of every eye in that room, aware of my sister refusing to meet my gaze, aware of David's father-in-law suddenly very interested in a spot on the carpet. Melissa had baked nothing, an odd detail I noticed only afterward, because in 3 years of hosting family meetings at her house, there had always been some plate of something on the counter. This one, apparently, had not been planned as a gathering. It had been planned as a proceeding, and I was the only person in the room who had walked in not knowing that. David opened the folder and slid a document toward me, several pages stapled together, dense with legal language, and explained gently that this was simply a durable power of attorney and a consent form for a senior living consultation. Nothing binding beyond that, just something to give the family peace of mind. Then Melissa said something that made my stomach drop. She turned to the room and said, "We already talked about this with Mom a few weeks ago, and she agreed it made sense, didn't you, Dorothy?" Every head in that room turned to me, waiting for me to confirm something I had never actually said. I did not raise my voice. I picked up the document, slowly, and I read it every page while the room sat in an increasingly uncomfortable silence around me. Buried on page 3, past all the soft language about peace of mind and family support, was a clause granting David full authority over my bank accounts, my house title, and any future real estate transactions, effective immediately upon signature, no expiration, no review. This was not a conversation starter. This was a legal document designed to hand my entire life over to my son in one signature, dressed up as a casual Sunday chat. I set the document down on the coffee table, folded my hands in my lap, and said, quite calmly, that I had never agreed to anything of the sort, that I found it interesting they had prepared a notarized document for a conversation I supposedly already agreed to, and that, as it happened, I had already met with my own attorney several weeks ago and made some updates to my estate that I felt were long overdue. The room went very, very quiet. Melissa's smile finally cracked. She said sharply that I was clearly being manipulated by someone, that a woman my age should not be making major financial decisions without her family present, that this was exactly the kind of confusion they had been worried about all along. David, red in the face now, asked who I had spoken to, what I had signed, whether I even understood what I was doing. The gentle, concerned tone from the birthday dinner was gone completely, replaced by something sharper, something that sounded a great deal more like fear than love. Melissa's voice climbed half an octave, the way it does when she is frightened rather than angry, though she has always been better at disguising the first as the second. She said, "We are only trying to help you, Dorothy. Why does everything have to turn into a fight with you lately?" I looked at her, quite calmly, and I said, Melissa, nothing has turned into a fight. I have simply declined to sign a document that would hand my house and my accounts to my son in a room with a notary you hired without asking me. After telling everyone here, I had already agreed to something I never once said yes to. I asked her directly which part of that she would like to explain to the room. That is when I reached into my purse and set my little digital recorder on the coffee table, right next to their manila folder, and I pressed play. Emma's small, sweet voice singing Happy Birthday filled the room first, and I watched several faces soften with confusion. Then, 20 minutes into the recording, David's own voice arrived clear as day, laying out his plan to move me into a facility and take over my accounts, followed by Melissa's voice agreeing. At my age, we really do need to think about the house too, don't you think? Before things get complicated with the will. Nobody in that room said a word for what felt like a full minute. My sister put her hand over her mouth. David's father-in-law looked down at his shoes. The notary, to her credit, quietly closed her leather folder and did not open it again. Melissa's face had gone the color of the folder on the table, and David, for the first time in this entire ordeal, had absolutely nothing to say. The very device they had assembled to make their plan look official, that room full of witnesses, had just become the audience for the truth instead. Later I learned, through my sister, that the notary David hired charged him an extra rush fee to come out to a private home on a Sunday, and that David had told her beforehand it was simply a routine matter, a signature, 20 minutes at most. I think about that sometimes, how confident he must have felt walking into that living room, how certain he was that I would simply sign whatever was placed in front of me, the way I suppose I always had, quietly, without complaint. For most of my life, for a long moment, I simply sat there, letting the silence do the work I did not need to do myself. I thought about all the years I had spent smoothing things over in that family, filling every uncomfortable pause with a joke or a change of subject, protecting everyone else's comfort at the cost of my own dignity. I did not fill this silence. I let David and Melissa sit inside it, in front of witnesses, exactly as I had been made to sit inside my own humiliation 3 weeks earlier in a steakhouse they had chosen and paid for. I stood up, straightened my cardigan, and said that I loved my family very much, that I had spent my whole life taking care of every single person in that room in one way or another, and that I would not be signing anything that day or any other day regarding my house or my accounts. I told them my will had already been updated, that my attorney had copies of everything discussed at Emma's birthday dinner, and that any further conversation about my finances could happen through Patricia Coleman's office, not around a coffee table with a notary nobody asked me about. Then I picked up my recorder, my purse, and I walked out of that house with my head high, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like myself again. The days after that meeting were strange and quiet in a different way than before. My sister called me crying, apologizing for staying silent at both the birthday dinner and the meeting at David's house, telling me she had been afraid of causing a rift in the family. Emma texted me a simple message that said, "Grandma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to say. I love you," which meant more to me than she probably realizes. Ryan drove over that same evening, sat with me on my back porch, and just said, "Grandma, whatever you need, I'm here, no explanation required." Melissa never called to apologize, not once, not in 6 weeks. She did send one text about 10 days after that meeting that read, "I hope you understand we only ever wanted what's best for the family." I did not respond. Some apologies are not actually apologies. They are simply attempts to close a conversation on favorable terms, and I have gotten old enough to tell the difference without needing to argue about it. Melissa and I have not really spoken since that Sunday afternoon, beyond the one unanswered text. She still comes to family gatherings with David, sits a little further from me than she used to, and I let her. I am not interested in punishing her, but I am no longer interested in pretending a closeness with her that was never really there to begin with, propped up for years by my own effort and my own silence. Some relationships, once you see them clearly, do not need to be repaired so much as simply named for what they were. David called me 4 times over the following week. I let the first two go to voicemail. On the third, I picked up and I told him, calmly and without anger, that I loved him, that I always would, but that I would not be discussing my will, my house, or my finances with him again outside of my attorney's office, and that trust, once it is broken the way he broke it, does not simply reset because he is uncomfortable with the consequences. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Okay, Mom," and hung up. It was not a resolution. It was a boundary, and honestly, it was the first real boundary I had set with my own son in over 40 years. Word of what happened in that living room traveled through the family the way these things always do, quietly, in phone calls between my sister and cousins I rarely speak to. I noticed a change after that, small but real. My cousin Barbara, who I had not heard from in over a year, called just to check on me, genuinely, no audit hidden inside the kindness. David's own sister, my other daughter-in-law's mother, sent a card that simply said, "Good for you, Dorothy. We should have said something sooner." I understood, hearing from people like that I had not caused a rift in my family so much as revealed one that had been there all along, and that some people, once they saw it clearly, finally found the courage to stand on the right side of it. 2 weeks later, Patricia called to let me know that David had contacted her office, apparently hoping to challenge the updated will on grounds of diminished capacity. Patricia informed him, politely but firmly, that we had a signed medical evaluation confirming full competency dated the same week as the changes, along with a recorded conversation demonstrating exactly the pressure he and Melissa had attempted to apply. David did not pursue it any further after that call. Patricia told me, with a small note of satisfaction in her voice, that in over 20 years of elder law she had rarely seen a case this cleanly documented, and that I should be proud of how carefully I had protected myself. A few weeks after all of it settled, Ryan came by on a Saturday and helped me finally clear out the garage, a project I had been putting off for 2 years. We found an old box of David's childhood things, report cards, a chipped baseball trophy, a photograph of the two of us outside the bakery the day it opened. Ryan held that photograph for a long moment and said, "Grandma, I hope you know none of what happened changes how much you're loved. Some of us just show it differently than others." I did not cry in front of him, but I cried a little after he left. The good kind of crying, the kind that comes from finally being seen. This past Thanksgiving, for the first time in 2 years, I hosted dinner again in my own home, at my own table, with my own good china that Frank bought me for our 20th anniversary. Ryan carved the turkey. Helen brought her sweet potato casserole, the one with the pecans David used to love as a boy. David and Melissa came too, quieter than they used to be, more careful, but they came, and nobody brought up power of attorney or community living, and I said grace at my own table like I have every single year since Frank died, and for a few hours it felt almost like enough if you're somewhere in the middle of a hard decision like that one right now, trying to protect yourself from people who are supposed to love you. I hope you will consider subscribing before you go. It costs nothing, and it helps me keep sharing stories like this one with people who need to hear them. All right, let me tell you where things stand for me now. These days, my Saturday mornings still belong to the Greenville Animal Rescue, and I still walk the same dogs, feed the same nervous rescues who flinch at loud noises the way I used to flinch at family dinners. Ryan comes by most Sundays now, sometimes with Emma, and we sit on my back porch and talk about nothing important. His classes, her softball season, my tomato plants, and it feels like the easiest thing in the world. Helen and I still have our Sunday coffee, and last month I added her, formally and gladly, as the person who will make medical decisions for me if I am ever unable to make them myself. David and I speak now, occasionally, carefully, mostly about Emma and Ryan, mostly short and polite. He has not apologized, not really, not in the way I think he should, though he did say once, quietly, on the phone, that he supposed he had let Melissa's worries about money get tangled up with what he told himself was concern for me. I told him I appreciated him saying that much. I have not undone anything in my will, and I do not plan to. Love and consequences are not opposites. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is show them clearly that actions have a cost. I think a great deal these days about how many women I know who are living some quieter version of what I went through. Not always this dramatic, not always with a recorder and a notary and a folder on a coffee table, but the same slow erosion underneath it, the same gentle language of concern covering the same hard motive underneath. I do not think David and Melissa believe themselves to be villains in this story. I think that is almost the most important thing to understand. Most people who try to take an old woman's life out of her own hands do not think of themselves as thieves. They think of themselves as helpers, right up until somebody makes them look directly at what they were actually doing. I still live in my little brick house on Larkspur Lane. I still drive my paid-off Buick. I still make my own decisions, every single one of them, about my money, my home, and my future, exactly as I have for the past 50 years of my life. I am not angry anymore, not most days. What I am, mostly, is clear. Clear about who showed up for me when it mattered and who only showed up for what I might leave behind. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this. Getting older does not mean you stop being the author of your own life. It does not mean your voice matters less, or your judgment matters less, or your right to decide what happens to what you built matters less. People who truly love you consult you. People who are only waiting on you manage you quietly, gently, and call it care. Dignity, I have learned, is not loud. It rarely looks like a speech or a slammed door. Most of the time it looks exactly like what I did, a quiet phone call to the right person, a folder of paperwork done carefully and on time, a decision made once and then simply not revisited no matter how much pressure follows it. If you remember one thing from tonight, let it be that. I know there are people watching this right now who are living some version of what I lived, being talked about instead of talked to, being managed instead of consulted, being made to feel like a burden in the very family you spent your life building. If that is you, I want you to hear me clearly. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to set boundaries with your own children. You are allowed to decide quietly and firmly exactly where your trust and your resources go. And you do not owe anyone an apology for choosing people who actually show up for you. I am not an inheritance waiting to be divided while I am still alive and still breathing and still perfectly capable of running my own life. I decided that a long time ago at a kitchen table over a cold cup of tea, and I have never once regretted it. Thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end. It means more to me than you know. If it moved you or reminded you of your own mother, your own grandmother, or maybe even yourself, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. I will see you in the next one.